Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first edition of the Friends Film Podcast. My name is Brian, and I'm here with my best friend Fowler. Say hello.
It's great to be on the airwaves, giving my opinions unsolicited as I love to do.
Yeah, we're here today to talk about the first film we watched together, which is Arrival. So, I'm going to start this by prefacing if you haven't seen Arrival, go watch the film before the podcast because this is going to be layered with a ton of spoilers. But first and foremost, to give a brief synopsis, if you haven't seen the film and you still want to hear us for some reason, essentially the film is about a linguistics expert and a physicist who have to interpret a language from an alien species that comes to Earth, and the whole plot revolves around that with some time-based elements and a lot of communication-based elements to begin with. So
We should also say that this is not. There's I think 12 different aliens interacting with 12 different countries. So it's that's also a part of the film that the we're
yes,
following mainly the American team, which is the physicist and the linguist that Brian was talking about. But later in the story, it becomes more important that the aliens are interacting with other countries, basically teams as well.
yeah, absolutely. So today we're just here to talk about kind of give a review of what we thought worked and what didn't work, but also to discuss the themes and elements of the movie itself. So I guess
Mhm.
I'll go ahead and start by talking about some of the themes and things going on. So as we about a little bit while we were watching the film together, we talked about the themes related to communication as well as themes related to time itself. So with
I would say that the first 2/3 of the film are very heavy on the communication theme,
yeah,
and then the last third of the film is very heavily on the time theme.
oh, absolutely. And I think the bigger thing we were talking about really was we were comparing it to the novella because we both ended up researching, looking at the novella. I will say one interesting. I'll talk about this sort of first because this is kind of in the
You should give
forefront
the
of it.
name of the novella though, really quickly.
Oh, the novella. Yes, it's I believe it's the story of my life. I believe is
Yep.
the title of it. Yeah. So that novella is about 50 some odd pages about ish. And the novella mostly focuses on the communication element as it relates to the written language, but also the verbal component of the alien's language. Um,
The
and
film is a lot longer, and one of the things that the film does that I like is the novella is very focused on the alien and American team part of the communication. Um, the film is much more siloed, where there's the communication between the alien and the American team, but also the American team communicating among itself, and then also the different nations who are communicating with each other about the aliens. So it's I think it's a very different end product from the
yeah,
novella.
but also, yes, you're right. There's a lot of different elements in the film that aren't incorporated into the novella. I think just purely based on the size of the text is a big part of it why. But also
Mm-hmm.
um another thing I was thinking about is what's always forefront in both the movie and in the I guess less in the movie compared to the novella, but there's a whole B story about the daughter's relationship to the mother and how that is
The
flipped.
linguist is the mother, just to be
The
clear.
linguist to be yeah, fair. But it's that sort of relationship and that connection there. And I think what's
Mm-hmm.
really interesting, I tend to think that um, you need a B story in that novella, but I'm wondering, do you think that B story really adds anything to it? Because in my personal opinion, it seemed like it was sort of um, added on in a way.
Yeah, I would agree. I think I really like this film. I was telling Brian earlier that it's like top 20 films in my opinion.
Mhm.
I do think that the film, um, I think the film is incredibly thematically rich and very symbolically rich and very very interesting. But I would say that I think it receives such a high grade because of its ambition and not necessarily because of its execution. And I do think that I think the film has problems with some of the B stories that don't come together as well. And the daughter relationship is one of the parts that I think is kind of undercooked in the film.
Yeah.
Um, I'm not really a touchy lovey, like I'm a very cerebral kind of dude, so I don't necessarily need as much of an emotional component in my films. And for me, the political intrigue of the different nations communicating together constituted the heart of the film for me. I was fine perceiving it more as like kind of a mystery thriller and enjoying kind of the hunt for knowledge rather than um, you know, in the novella where you don't have that component and the B story is way more important, I think, to flesh out the protagonist linguist character.
Yeah, but I also think like a big issue I have with the movie compared to the novella, in my eyes, is that the communication I think in the novella is way more focused on than even in the movie. Like yes,
Mm.
the communication is like the center theme, and like there's so like especially like you were saying in the first two thirds, it's heavy in that. But I think they got more into like the science of linguistics in the novella compared to uh, what they were doing in the movie. And I think that a lot of that simplicity is for the audience sake, right? Because I think if you make a movie that's so complex and so science heavy, it needs to resonate with an audience goer who's just watching films, right?
I would agree with that, but I think that was in many cases deliberate because if the main theme of the novella is about communication and about like the linguist and the aliens being better and better at understanding each other. I would say the stronger theme and the focus of the film is miscommunication. And what I mean by that is almost every part of that film, at least for the first two thirds, is designed to make it difficult to understand. The aliens are not very humanoid. It's difficult to empathize with them. They're constantly shrouded in mist and fog. You know, this the aliens are difficult to connect with as an audience versus like Star Trek aliens or Star Wars aliens, and I think that's deliberate. The film is incredibly claustrophobic. There's all these barriers. You know, people wearing suits, windows between aliens and humans, the ships that separate, and the atmospheres inside the ships that separate the different humans together, and then you know all the different language in the film of like the radio broadcasts and the Chinese broadcasts. You know, it's a film that's incredibly kind of disconnected and broken, and there's very little, you know, big unifying shots or like everyone being on the same page. You know, I think in many ways, Arrival, especially the first two thirds, it really makes a film that's incredibly broken up and disjointed. And I think that's deliberate to kind of demonstrate how difficult real communication is with people who are different from you.
Hmm. And I think this was another element we just talked about, like just from the basis of like the filmmaking process as well. It must have been like a very odd thing for Amy Adams and Jeremy Renner to sit there and like have to play out these scenes without having like an actual scene partner because the aliens are this big CGI sort of monster, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that that also plays into it a little bit. Like we can see times where it's like it, it plays well at times. I think what to go on to a sort of related point though. I think
Mm-hmm.
what I was really thinking about was how much more real you could feel like emotionally you could feel with the movie compared to the novella, and that could also be like you get the visual and the audio more from actually watching a film compared to reading something. But I think like Jeremy Renner's character, Amy Adams' character, that them at the first sign of this alien just having a complete panic attack probably strikes as what most people would experience in that situation, right? Uh, but it is very interesting to see how these two pieces of media, like how different they are, because the ending is completely different as well. And I know
And I
you,
think it. We'll talk about this later, but
yeah,
I think the movie's message is completely different from the message of the novella.
I
I
totally
think
agree.
they're arguing very different things.
Yeah, I so let's now like take a moment to discuss, like, I guess, what really, like, we enjoyed, what we how we would rank it, like, in terms of the films we've seen. I know you were talking about it being a top 20 sort of film. Um,
Mhm.
Me personally, like, I enjoy the science fiction genre as a whole. Like, and to
Mhm.
have something this, like, existential, this have this sort of deeper conversation in a science fiction film, uh,
Mhm.
I tend to see it less and less. I've only seen it with a couple, things like Ex Machina, things like The Thing, which we'll probably discuss at some point as well. But
Mhm.
things that hit on, like, this human element of combining science fiction with that um, sort of existentialism and all these other elements really incorporate, like, into a really great product. I think the acting was outstanding for it. The musical choices were great for it. Um,
Mhm.
and from a sound design perspective as well, like the guttural noises of that alien language, and like the sort of even when towards the end when Amy Adams is in the tank with them, that sort of muffled sort of sounds and all the air whistling by, it was quite a
Yeah,
fascinating thing to listen to.
it was very. I would say it's very visceral.
Yeah.
You really feel the environment.
Oh yeah.
I think you were talking about the thing earlier. I think the thing is also when we discuss it later. I think the thing is also really a film about communication in the same way Arrival is. But I
Interesting.
think the thing that I find interesting about Arrival and the thing is the way that they display communication being radically different.
Hmm.
Like I think a lot of those existential sci-fi novels that or sorry, sci-fi movies you're talking about, the way they show loneliness, the way they show the difficulty of communication is like a lot of kind of brooding, a lot of inner monologue, a lot of like solitary time to yourself.
Hmm.
And in a weird way, Arrival is a film about humanity in which um, there's very little whole humanity. Like, besides Amy Adams' character, basically everyone that all the humans that you interact with in the film, you're only seeing their actions. You're not actually seeing their thought process or their feelings. And I think the big way that you do that is like, you know, um, a huge part of Arrival is the world's response to the aliens. But I think very tellingly, it's not a lot of shots of the people directly. You get most of your information about what's happening in the rest of the world through like news broadcasts and through, and through, uh, you know, relaying of communication.
Hmm.
We're hearing and seeing all these reports of, people responding to the aliens through mass suicides, through terrorism. We're seeing kind of news broadcasts of people panicking and of like the Chinese, in particular in this film, the Chinese nation, their incredibly aggressive and paranoid responses to the aliens. And so it's kind of a film about humans where you see very few humans. You're really just seeing lots of people reacting in very extreme ways without really knowing why they're reacting or the thought process, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think it's a really and we talked about this a lot while we were watching the film. The thing that the film does really well is establish that atmosphere, right? Like, it's not
Mm-hmm.
just an American problem; it's a national problem, and it's really something that gives a lot of uh, understanding to, like, how different nations would react to the situation, like how how it would play out in a realistic sense. I think this movie, even for a movie being about 50 foot tall seven-legged, you know, aliens, it still has that level of being grounded in that realism, you know?
I think this is easily one of the most realistic sci-fi movies ever made. Like the the fear and the paranoia, but also the opportunism and the greed of the way that the nations interact with the aliens, their distrust of other nations, and the way they're sort of doing this arms race. And then, I think you talked about that earlier. Like Amy Adams, I think she does a really great job in this film, alternating at different points when interacting with the aliens, with like horror, with shock, with wonder, with curiosity. It's a very human film, but it's a film made up of a lot of snapshots rather than following anything particularly deeply.
Yeah. And I think that, like, a point of criticism, though, we both talked about this as well and tend to agree, is that the we talked earlier about the B plot with the daughter being incorporated
Mm-hmm.
into the film. It felt less necessary since there was so much stuff going on, right? And I think another thing to like talk about there is like in the compared to the novella, something the novella actually did better than the movie itself was developing these characters, right? Developing our main protagonists, being the
Mm-hmm.
uh, linguist and the physicist. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's really interesting to see like what the movie picks up from the novella and does well with it, but also what it takes over from it and doesn't do as well, you know?
Yeah, I think one of the things I like about Arrival that I think gives it a realism is you kind of realize at the end of the film, like it's sort of an anti-alien invasion film where the the aliens never really want to hurt the humans. They're there to actually give the humans a gift. And um, you know, in the novella, I feel like communication is portrayed as basically a universally positive experience. Like there is no downside to communicating with other people and learning more about you. But in the film, miscommunication is the biggest source of tension in the film. And a lot of the death in the film, a lot of the violence, a lot of the the danger really comes from miscommunication. It comes from everyone being more connected or everyone communicating with each other, and then basically like paranoia or greed or rage or confusion causing these destructions. And I think I like the fact that the film focuses on the macro of communication and also the dark side of it.
Yeah, and I think like it's really interesting because there's that whole plot in the second act where, you know, the term weapon comes up, right? And it's
Mhm.
misinterpreted as being this thing of like, oh, the aliens have a weapon they're going to use, where it's really the aliens communicating and saying they're giving them a weapon and their weapon is their language and the ability to perceive because of their language, right? Um,
Yeah, Arrival definitely makes the argument that the languages, ways we communicate with the world, and the grammar of the way we communicate with the world really determines the way the world is. And
mhm.
I think that's a very interesting idea. I don't know if I agree with it to the extent the movie does, but it's definitely something interesting to think about.
So I guess while we have some more time here, let's kind of go into more talking about the ending of both because
Okay.
it's radically different. Um, Now
Mhm.
I'll tell you that from what I was seeing from the ending of the novella compared to the movie, it's completely different, right? It still has that time element in the novella where they're talking about how the languages are different because the what do you call it? The aliens. Oh, I'm blanking. Uh,
Heptapods.
Heptapods. Yes, thank you. So the heptapods, they have a different perception of time, which stays consistent throughout both mediums, but they eventually disembark in both sort of ways, except it's a lot less contentious in the novella than it is in the actual film. Um, and I'm really curious because I know you had a big contention with the time element in the movie itself compared to the novella. Do you want to speak a little more on that?
Yeah, I think so. A theme of both is sort of determinism, right? Where um, seeing the world the heptapods do, communicating in a way that you don't perceive time, where you're simultaneously in the past, present, and future. And it's kind of paralyzing to some degree. I mean, you don't really have free will if everything is set up in advance, and you
Hmm.
can't really change the future if you were already in the future. And in the novella, I think this is framed as like, in a sense, a positive thing, where like it's the novella is. I read it as being a lot about acceptance. That
Hmm.
basically the linguist sees her future and she understands like her daughter's going to die, her husband's going to leave her, she's going to die, but she chooses to sort of like go forward anyway. That knowing the end does not necessarily make the beginning and middle less worthy or less meaningful. Um, in the film, I think um, it has a very different argument where um, it is being able to see into the past, present, and future that stops the world from ending, that allows the Chinese nation and the American nation to ultimately work together and make peace. And eh, I don't think there's the same level of determinism in the film. Like, they make a big deal about the heptapods. Their language being a tool, and it feels much more like a tool rather than in the novella where it feels more like a gift, if that
Hmm.
makes sense.
Yeah, no, I could totally see where you're coming from in that regard. I guess now that we're kind of caught up and we've discussed the themes, things, is there anything like, I guess, where would you rate this on your scale? Like, because I know you run, what is it, a point 0.5 base scale?
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Um, I think the first. So I have a bit of a quibble. I really have an interest in communication, and I really agree with a lot of the ideas of communication that are in the film. How dangerous miscommunication is, misinterpretation. How often conflict is caused by a lack of information, and the power, but also danger of interacting with people who are different from you. I agree with a lot of that. I don't know if I necessarily agree with a lot of the time ideas of the ending. And for me, that really weakens the film because I think the point of communication is that you don't have all the information and you don't know all that's happening, right? Like that's the reason communication is useful as a field. But in this film, I mean, there's no point in communicating if you already know all that is going to happen. And even more than that, then you're locked into your fate, if that makes sense. So I feel like in some ways, the ending, the determinism of it, and the certainty of it, I think it clashes with a lot of the themes in the first two-thirds of the film in a way that is not necessarily positive or intentional. Does that
hmm,
make sense?
yeah. So, I think from my own understanding too, like, I rate this pretty high on my scale. But I think I tend to agree with you that a lot of what detracts is that sort of ending where it's very different from the novella, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I've seen plenty of, like, for example, one of film we talked about already a little bit was The Thing, right? The Thing was based on a short story from the 30s, I believe, called Who Goes There? And
Mhm.
that was completely different. And it was a completely different take that John Carpenter produced there. But I think with here, the difference is. although some being better, like the relationships, or not relationships, I'm sorry, the human sort of element to it, the atmosphere to it, really enhanced it. I think what really hindered it was, this sort of time element that gets incorporated way later that feels almost tacked on, I guess.
Yeah, I think the thing that they were trying to do is one of the big spoilers at the end of the film is um, there's two big spoilers I think that involve time.
Yeah.
The You obviously think that the flashbacks throughout the film are the past, but then you kind of figure out at the end that they're actually in the future because she's using the heptapods way of perceiving reality, and so um, yeah, the flashbacks are from the future. And then the other one is Amy Adams kind of has a running dialogue throughout the film, and it's kind of unclear um, who she's talking to. But then, kind of at the end of the film, you kind of realize that she's talking to her daughter in the future, and it's not really meant. She's not talking to the audience. She's not talking to her diary. She's not talking to herself. She's talking to her daughter. Um, so I think I don't know. It's very different. I think to some degree the stakes being bigger is part of what makes the time thing a little weird. Where like
Mm,
in the novella, because it's mainly like the aliens aren't really threatening, and there aren't all these other powers. Like figuring out the aliens is kind of an intellectual task that's relatively low stakes, and then having that sense of determinism is emotionally cathartic, but relatively low scale because it's just the linguist confronting her mortality.
mm,
In the film, because they've blown it up and the Chinese are involved and there's nuclear weapons and there's a very real possibility that if things go wrong, tens of millions of people will die. I feel like the determinism feels weirder and doesn't feel as deserved because you are just dealing with such a massively higher level of stakes. And then I think the film is also strange because there is this idea of determinism in it, but also, I mean, the linguist does change the future. You know what I mean?
yeah, and like it's a really odd sort of concept at the end there. But overall, like I think it's definitely a film worth watching, especially if you're into that
Mm-hmm.
sort of existential sort of science fiction and you know uh, really something that like leaves you thinking afterwards, which is I think great for a sci-fi film. So
I
overall,
agree.
sorry, I was gonna say overall, is there any other element you want to talk about before we kind of have our closing sort of remarks here, or
Yeah, I think that one of the ideas of the film and in the novel that I think is really interesting is the idea that language is reality, right? Like
mm,
the heptapods in communicating and perceiving the world or in communicating in a timeless fashion in which the past, the present, and the future are all combined. They, in a sense, shape reality. Like the way they perceive the world is that way, but also the way the reality kind of works is that way. And I find that very interesting. That the Chinese are really damned in this film because not only do they perceive things in a linear fashion, in the way all humans do, but they perceive it in a linear sort of aggressive strategic fashion in which everything is perceived as being goals in which you can win or lose.
yeah,
And I think that's a very interesting critique of realpolitik and the way that international politics really plays. Where,
mm,
I guess the question the film would kind of bring up is like, is international politics so brutal and cold blooded because that's the nature of human interaction? Or is that just because we frame and perceive human interaction that way? And so it's a self fulfilling prophecy that's preventable to some degree.
yeah, and I think there's a lot of elements you could definitely take away from this film, especially given how many things are going on. It feels like there's a couple different subplots to really look at. So, but
Mhm.
yeah, I think overall, like, it's definitely a film worth checking out if you haven't already. But yeah, any other last things you want to say before signing out here?
Yeah, I would say Arrival is maybe the most ambitious sci-fi film I've ever seen in terms of what it's really trying to say. And I would say it's unmatched in terms of its ability to build tension and suspense. Like really just unbelievable. There's very little happening action wise. Very little directly is occurring. There's no inner monologue. There's no real like delving into other people's emotions, and yet it's hair raising. It just keeps amping up. And I think
Hmm.
until the third act, where it kind of is a weird clusterfuck, like I thought it was a hell of a ride.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Definitely would recommend the film for anyone who hasn't seen it yet. But overall, that's gonna be it for our first podcast episode. Thank you guys for tuning in to this one. I'm really glad for you guys sticking around and listening to us just shoot the shit for about 30 minutes or so. And hopefully we'll be getting some more podcasts out here in the weeks to come. But yeah, y'all have a great rest of your week.
Thank you very much.